September 1967, somewhere in an office building in Washington, D.C., someone signs a document that marks the end of the American passenger train as it had existed for more than a century. No public announcement beforehand, no serious negotiations, no transition period to absorb the economic damage. One memo to the railroad companies across the entire country with a message that amounts to this: "We are done with you. All contracts are terminated effective immediately. First-class mail will now go exclusively by airplane and everything else by truck." At the time, Santa Fe Railroad was reported to lose about $35 million a year in mail revenue from that decision, in one stroke, from one day to the next. Think about that number for a second. $35 million a year, not from passengers buying tickets, from envelopes. The Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Pennsylvania Railroad, they all received that same memo with that same message, and they all found themselves staring into the same financial abyss. Within 4 years, the federal government established an emergency organization to salvage what was left of passenger rail service in the United States. That organization is called Amtrak, and it still exists today. Permanently underfunded, chronically criticized, and for more than 50 years now in constant debate about its own fundamental right to exist. But here is the strange thing about this whole story. Ask the average American why the passenger train actually disappeared, and you will get predictable answers about the rise of the automobile, the democratization of air travel, the construction of the interstate highways, the mass migration to the suburbs. All factors that played a role, absolutely. But the actual death blow came from a direction that almost nobody saw coming, from a government agency that for more than 100 years had been completely dependent on those same trains it was now abandoning without a second thought. To understand what really happened here, you need to know something that appears in no American textbook and that most people never hear. Many passenger trains in America had been losing money on passengers alone for decades. Ticket sales simply did not cover the operational costs, and this was not a new phenomenon from the 60s. It had been that way since the economic crisis of the 30s. What kept those trains running despite all that? What made them financially viable despite the empty seats were the mail contracts with the federal government. That means whenever you saw a beautiful passenger train rolling through a small town in Kansas, Nebraska, or anywhere else in rural America, you were actually looking at a postal service on wheels. It just happened to have some seats attached. The Railway Mail Service, officially established in 1869 under the leadership of George B. Armstrong in Chicago, formed the beating heart of the entire American postal system for the better part of a century. And this is important. Mail was not sorted somewhere in a building and then loaded onto a train to be transported to its destination. The mail was sorted while the train was already moving, in special cars called Railway Post Office cars, staffed by clerks who had one of the hardest and most dangerous jobs you could find anywhere in America at that time. These men had to know literally thousands of place names by heart, including every possible route to get a letter from any random location to any other random location in the country. They were tested every 6 months on both speed and accuracy, and the passing threshold was set at 97% correct sorting. If you scored 96%, you received an official warning from the superintendent, and repeated failures meant you were out. They worked in the car directly behind the locomotive, the most vulnerable and dangerous position in the entire train consist, and they carried revolvers because the mail they transported was genuinely valuable, and robberies occurred with some regularity across the network. Between 1890 and 1905, more than 100 of these clerks lost their lives in train accidents, and nearly 1,000 were seriously injured. The second Assistant Postmaster General declared before Congress in 1893 that railway mail clerks had a higher casualty rate than all other categories of train personnel combined. At the absolute peak of the system, somewhere around 1915, there were 20,000 of these clerks working on nearly 4,000 mail cars, spread across 216,000 miles of routes throughout the entire country. The railroad companies had collectively invested around $950 million in infrastructure specifically for the mail service, specialized cars, terminals, loading platforms, the works. Trains like the Broadway Limited and the 20th Century Limited carried passengers certainly, but the actual financial engine behind their continued existence was the mail. As long as the post office maintained its contracts, the railroad companies had a concrete reason to keep offering passenger services, even on routes where ticket sales alone could never possibly justify the expense. This system worked. It had worked for generations. And then someone in Washington found a better way to sort envelopes. Zip codes arrived in 1963. 5 digits. That's all it took. Suddenly, every letter in America could be read by a machine instead of by a clerk who had spent years memorizing thousands of towns, routes, and connections. The post office started building large regional sorting centers, so-called sectional centers, places where automated equipment could process mail around the clock, faster and cheaper than any human on a moving train ever could. The men with the revolvers and the 97% accuracy scores were not fired. They just stopped being necessary. The machines did not need to be tested. The machines did not get injured in wrecks. The machines did not ask for raises. In 1966, the Chicago Post Office, the largest post office in the entire world at that time, collapsed completely under a massive backlog of unprocessed mail. The pressure to modernize and centralize became impossible to ignore any longer. And in September 1967 came the decision that changed everything. The Post Office Department canceled all mail-by-rail contracts at once. First-class mail would now go exclusively by airplane. Everything else would go by truck. The trains were done. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Railroad companies that had run passenger trains for decades, because mail revenue more than compensated for passenger losses, filed discontinuance requests within months. The Interstate Commerce Commission was completely flooded with paperwork. Routes that had functioned uninterrupted since the 19th century disappeared from the timetable within a single year. By 2071, the situation had become so critical that the federal government was forced to step in. Amtrak was established as a quasi-governmental organization that took over the remnants of the National Passenger Network, including heavily outdated rolling stock, infrastructure that had been neglected for years, and a completely impossible mandate to operate profitably while being systematically excluded from the federal trust funds that aviation and highways had access to. The very last railway post office ran on June 30th, 2077, between New York and Washington, D.C. It was 113 years of uninterrupted service, and it concluded in relative silence. Almost nobody noticed. Today, most first-class mail is transported by AIR under contracts with private carriers rather than by rail. The trains did not stop because Americans lost interest in traveling by rail. They stopped because a government agency found a cheaper way to move paper. That is the whole story.